Welcome back to another episode of VZ Garage 360. We're going to continue with this 4.6 here. I just pulled it. It's been a couple months, but I haven't done anything with it. But let's continue with this. If you remember from a previous video, there was some weird knocking sounds coming from this thing. Let's try to figure out what it was. First, I'm going to have to pull off this flywheel here, and I'm going to put it on my engine stand. Looks like we have 6 bolts on this flywheel. Romeos like to use 6 bolts. Windsors normally use 8. They're usually 17, so let's see. Perfect. Ooh, it's got an interesting smell to it. Smells like this engine has been beat on a little bit. It's got that pungent oil burn smell when taking these off. So I think once we open this thing up, it's not going to look very good. Once I get the flywheel off, I like to use it as a tray. I put all the bolts and everything on it, and it's a nice little, I guess, platter, if you will, of all the accessory bolts and everything for the pulleys. Next, we're going to take this spacer off here. There's a little plug right here. We'll just pop that out quick. Now with the flywheel and the backing plate off, let's put this on the engine stand. So it's been a little bit since you've seen this engine here. This is the 5.4 that's going in this Mustang, and it's been sitting out in the cold in my garage. It is a dry garage for the most part, but since I heated it up in here with my little torpedo heater, this thing is starting to sweat. When a newly machined engine sits out, sweating is the most common problem for having it rust right away. I'm going to be using WD-40. I'm going to spray it in the cylinders and all the bare metal parts on the internals underneath as well. This is just to try to prevent rust from forming on all these bare metal surfaces. Now that these parts have been covered with WD-40, this is not a permanent solution. This is not going to prevent rust entirely. This is just to prevent it in the short term. I do plan on building this very soon. It looks good right now. No rust over these 2 months that it's been in my garage. I don't think any rust will form by the time I put this all together. So short term, WD-40 will work.
So now I'm going to use my engine hoist, get this engine off of this engine stand so I can use it for that 4.6. So if you remember in a previous video, when I was putting in all the freeze plugs on the side and the front, being that it was on the engine stand, it's much easier to do these back ones when it's off the engine stand, so I'm going to do that real quick. If you didn't watch the previous one, what I like to use for my freeze plugs is this Permatex. It's basically Forma gasket for aviation use, but it works really well with freeze plugs. When you open this up, you'll have a little brush inside, and the stuff is almost like liquid. And you just put a nice coat in there, just like that. Grab your freeze plug. This one is a 1 3/4 on the back. I'm using a impact socket as a punch. Just put it in there like that and hammer it in. And if you remember, you don't want to hammer this all the way in because it'll fall inside the block. You just want to go to the bottom of the bevel on the engine block. And then do the same thing on the other side here. That should be good there. So let's go put this 5.4 down somewhere and put the 4.6 on the engine stand. So we've got our 4.6 here. And the nice thing with the 4.6 and the 5.4 bell housing bolts, exactly the same location between both of them. So when you're moving from one of these to the other, you don't have to change this placing at all. You just leave it where it is and bolt it right up. Now that it's on the engine stand, I'm going to get my chain off here. I'll go through the sizes of the bolts of all the pulleys up here, and then I'll quickly go through and take all of these off. So I usually like to start with the water pump. These are 10mm bolts right here. You pop off the pulley, and there's going to be 13s behind it. This right here looks like a 10. Usually it's a 13 on the F-150s. We have two 13s here. We have the cam position sensor, which is an 8mm, and then the harmonic balancer, which is an 18. Once you get this bolt off here, you're going to have a harmonic balancer tool, which I'll show you how to use. Oh boy, that's stuck on there. Wow, okay. This is going to be interesting. I would probably say this is the first time I've ever had one of these pulleys I didn't want to come off. Wow. Oh my goodness. Why are you fighting me? Now that that's off, I'm not reusing that pulley. That was insane. Usually if you can spin these things, you can get them out. Take a little screwdriver. You don't want to go nuts because you don't want to break this tab off. Just keep working it back and forth while twisting. It'll come out. And one sensor I forgot. Don't forget about your crank sensor. You don't have to pull this out to get the front cover off, but being that we're switching the entire engine, I want to try to reuse this if I can. Well, gotta get the big boy out. Now that I have the harmonic balancer bolt out, I'm going to remove the water pump. When you remove a water pump on these, it usually likes to drain a lot of coolant when you do that. So I'm going to try to prevent a mess. I went and grabbed my oil pan here, And I'm going to put it underneath, try to catch it to hopefully prevent a giant mess. I am going to replace this water pump here, so I'm not necessarily concerned about trying to save it. So I'm just going to use a hammer and try to knock this thing out. I'm actually surprised not a lot of coolant came out. That's a good thing. And that probably would have been easier with a bigger hammer. So now it's time for the harmonic balancer. I'm going to go get the tool that I'm going to use to take this off. So this right here is a harmonic balancer tool. You can pick up one of these at Harbor Freight super cheap. I think I only paid about 20 bucks for it. But the way this is going to function is these holes right here are threaded. This will fit in here just like that. And you put bolts through here, and then the center bolt, which is this one with a tip like this, will go through there, push against the crank, and pull that off of there. So over the years, with using this, I have lost a significant number of bolts from this set. So this is a time to utilize your bolt stash. Everybody has one if you work on cars. So this one's probably from a modular engine. I believe it's a front cover bolt. But I don't know, this one might be from the Honda Prelude I had a while ago that I don't have anymore. Really, anything that has the right thread that can fit in here, it'll work. Being that these holes are super rusty, I'm going to take my tap here and try to clean it up a bit. The hole size on this is an M8 by 125. So I'm going to do this by hand. I don't want to use a drill for this. And just clean up these threads a bit. Now that these threads are cleaned up a bit, let's go ahead and put on our tool. One thing to be aware of, there is nothing back here that is going to prevent going into this front cover. If we took an impact and put this all the way down, we would put a hole in our front cover. We only want to go down as far as what finger tight will go. Any farther than that, it's no good. So we got our first one. Second. And third bolt. You'll notice that the bolts I selected are not the same length. So I'm gonna take this one out and look for a little bit longer one. I see one right here, I believe. This one looks very similar to that, so put that one in instead. Okay. Check it just to make sure that they're about the same length. Now we're going to put this threaded rod in, which is going to push against the crank. And you can use an impact to drive this in to pull this out. This specific one is a 14 millimeter. When you are pulling it out, just be sure to have a hand on this. That way, when it's all the way off, it doesn't fall. All right, got that off. And now we can just remove our bolts, back this out a little bit, and we can take our tool off. And that is how you remove a harmonic balancer from a modular engine. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this tube right here. It's held in the back by a single bolt. The bolt is right here. It's got a little stud on it, and it is a 13, so I'm just going to remove that real quick.
With the bolt removed, we should now be able to spin it like this. There's going to be two small O-rings here on this outlet, and we're just going to try to spin it and pull it off. Just like that.
When I took this engine out, I did not drain the oil, so I'm going to drain the oil now. And going off of this oil, oh, it's very metallic-y. There was something going on with this. There's way too much grit in there. Next, I'm going to get the oil filter off. And that was really loose. Looks like the gasket came off with it. That doesn't happen often. But if this were to happen during an oil change, always make sure that the oil filter comes off with the gasket. If you go to try to put a new oil filter on here with this gasket in place, you are going to have one heck of a mess. There's going to be oil everywhere. So, one thing to be aware of. With our oil filter off, we can take off this housing. There's 4 bolts, and they all look like they're 13s on this model. So, I can get those out now. This gasket right here, this is usually a Ford thing. It happens with intake gaskets too. This rubber will start expanding in here, and it'll actually push this plastic out and break it. And that's where a lot of your coolant leaks come from, is these gaskets. So, another thing to be aware of. And I'm going to try to get some coolant out of here. Coolant likes to stay in the bottom of the block. I'm just going to tip this engine and hope that most of the coolant will come out of that coolant port into my 5-gallon bucket. I know there's still coolant in there, but we should be able to take these heads off now without having to worry about coolant being spilled on the floor. So the next things we'll take care of now we have to get the manifold off on this side and the motor mount. So I'm going to take those off now. Looks like it's 13s holding this in, which is pretty common. I kind of like to start with the motor mount first. Next thing we're going to do is go through all the exhaust bolts. Okay, all of them seem to be 13 still. Looks like we got one underneath here that's probably close to a 12, so I'm going to try to get a 12 on there. All right, that is loose. Manifold off. With doing this 5-4 swap, I will have to come up with a different way of running that EGR tube, but we'll worry about that when we run into it.
So the difference between this side and the other side, once you get the manifold off, is you have your dipstick tube right here. Very corroded down here, so I wouldn't be surprised if I have a difficult time getting this out, but we'll see what happens. This bolt right here is an 8mm. And try to wiggle this a little bit. And I don't think I'm going to be able to save this. That's okay. With this 5-4 that I'm going to be putting in, I will have to get a new one of these anyway, since it's got a taller deck height. So on this side, I'm going to remove the motor mount, 13mm. And for these bolts here, 4/6s, kind of known for this. 5-4 is a little bit more. They like to break these bolts. That's from these getting warm and cold while running the engine and turning it off. These things just break over time. I have seen them to where this actually cracks right in half, but not super common that happens, but I have seen it. I've actually literally taken these off in 2 pieces. But these are supposed to be 13s. Don't know. They could be 12s. They could be 11 3/4. I don't know. We'll find out. We'll start with a 13 on these, see how many we get off, and if we have to go to a smaller size socket, we'll go to a smaller size socket. So I think we got pretty lucky on this side. All of the studs came out, nothing broke. So yeah, can't complain with that. Now that we have all our accessories off, I move them off to the side with the flywheel with all of the bolts on it. So now it's on to internal engine stuff. So these bolts here are 8mm. I was doing enough of these to where I went and got myself a deep 8mm socket. Most sets don't come with this. They do with a 1/4 inch, but for a 3/8, no set usually has this. So it's kind of a oddball socket. Took a little bit to find one, but super useful for these bolts right here with that big old stud on it. So I'm gonna zip all these off real quick and get the valve covers off. So just going to come in here and just pry up a little bit, and we can get our valve cover off. This is a Romeo block, so we are going to have to reuse these if we're planning to use these heads on our 5.4. Another tall tale sign of this is a Romeo. This, of course, the valley is going to be different, but they have, I guess you could call, cages over top of these cams. That is always going to be a Romeo. Windsor's only had caps over it, not a full cage. So I'm going to get this other side off real quick. So on this particular valve cover, there's one bolt on the side here that's a 13. Now that we have our valve covers off, let's start working on this front cover. You could go to the oil pan next, but being that it just drained the oil, there's still going to be quite a bit of oil down there, so I'd like to pull this off first so the oil pan can collect everything that we drop as far as the fluid. So on this front cover, there's going to be a bunch of 13s with some 17s intermixed with it. On the 543 valves, these are going to be, I believe, 21s or 22 millimeter. So if you have a 3 valve, watch out for those. So I was wrong on the size on these. These are 18s. Now that we have all the bolts out up here, we have 4 oil pan bolts underneath. And these are going to be 13s. So when taking this off, there are going to be 2 pins on either side here. These are basically alignment pins. When you go to put this on, they're going to want to stick to those pins. So as you're prying on this, don't go crazy. You don't want to crack this. Just work it nice and easy. Now that we have this off, let's get off the rest of our spaghetti string gaskets. So looking at this, looks like this guide right here is broken. So that could have been causing all kinds of racket right there. The rest of it doesn't look terrible. So you'll notice this has the plastic tensioners. I'm not a huge fan of these because it only uses oil pressure to push this plunger out. The older style is a steel housing that uses oil to push a plunger out, but it also has a stopper that's got a ratcheting mechanism to it. And it keeps this pushed out even if this engine were to lose oil pressure. And then in turn, you don't lose the timing on your engine and possibly valve hits piston. So when I go to rebuild this with a 5.4, I am going to replace this tensioner with one that has that ratcheting mechanism because I like the safeguard actually being there, not just relying on that oil pressure. So these tensioners are going to be using a 10mm bolt, and take the tensioners off first. And we may lose a little oil here, so put something underneath it. With the tensioner off, we can take this guide off. It just slides off this pin here. And looking at it, it's got quite the groove in it, so this has been in use for quite a while. I can take our tone ring off for our crank position sensor. Then we can pull off our chain on this one side. This guide right here is being held in with 8mm bolts. And now we're good on this side. We'll do the exact same thing on this side. Two 10mm bolts here. Pull off the tensioner here, take the guide off, and we're going to take this guide off as well. This side can be a little bit of a pain to get the tensioner out just because it sits in here a little bit. I'm going to take my tiny little pry bar, go on the back side here, and just pull that out. Pull off our chain here. And then we can pull off this little gear. Next, I'm going to take off the heads. I will take the cam out eventually, but just to disassemble this engine, I'm going to leave it all put together. These modular engines come in two different flavors for head bolts. Some of them are 13s, some of them are 15s. I've seen the 13s more, but this one ends up being a 15mm flavor. Now that we have all the bolts loose, let's grab them out of there. We don't have to worry about the head popping off because there are dowels in here that hold it in place. We still want to be kind of aware that, hey, this thing, if this engine rolls, this thing could pop off of here, so you might want to try to keep a hand on it at all times, but those dowels should hold it in place. And man, it stinks when you pull these things out of here. Man, this thing was driven hard. So when you pull this, there's probably going to be some coolant, maybe some oil. So try to stay out from underneath it to prevent getting wet from either coolant or oil. Whoa. Whoa, where'd that go? That's not good. So I found our noise. I pulled off this head, and look what I found. That's a valve. and it was banging and clanging around inside this engine. I was told originally that it was a cracked flex plate. That is not the case. Flex plate was absolutely fine. This was our problem. I'm a little worried about that head. I don't see any nicks or damage to it, but it is possible it is cracked. I'm gonna take it to a machine shop and see if I can save it, but I may have to use a different head for this engine. To get this other head off here, most of the weight on this is now on this side, and it's going to want to tilt to this side. So I'm going to rotate the engine so the head is up here. And as you're turning, there may be coolant coming out of those water jackets there. Oh, I hear a little bit. I hear a little bit. Let's turn it back. Okay. So, same thing on this side. 15 millimeter head bolts in here. Let's loosen them up in the right sequence and get this head off of here. Man, this thing stinks. Wow. That's one thing you'll find when working on engines. You start taking bolts apart, and it smells like straight up sewage. All right. Looking in this engine here. Wow. Oh my goodness. So, look at that. I don't know if you can see that there. That is everywhere inside this engine. In all these little areas, it's just nothing but metal flakes. This thing, I'm going to be surprised if we can save anything on this engine, honestly. Gonna try, but we'll see. There is no significant damage on this side, so that's a good thing. No valves that are broken, just a lot of carbon. Okay, I'm at the point right now where I can see coolant right here. So I'm gonna see if I can't try to catch this in some kind of pan and rotate this thing all the way over so we can get that oil pan off. So as I was turning this thing, I heard a lot of jingling and jangling happening in here. I'm not going to turn this thing all the way over because I don't want all these pieces going up into that crank. So I am going to remove all the bolts and drop it from the bottom. All these bolts down here are 13 millimeter. So this one here didn't want to come out with a 13, actually 2. So I'm going to take my 12, smack it on there, and see if I can't get it out that way. Okay. See what's going on here. Holy cow. Wow. I've got to show you guys this. So take a look at that. So we have bearings here, pieces of connecting rod. Looks like 2 connecting rods. This thing is really torn apart. And if you can see right there, that's where the valve used to be. It's gone. It fell into that cylinder and it must have hit that piston. And that connecting rod must have just broken into a million pieces because of it. And I'm guessing it took out the cylinder right next to it on the crank. So let's flip this thing over and see exactly what's going on with this engine. I'm really curious now. So take a look right here. Connecting rod completely gone. And watch this. That connecting rod broke right in half. So the bottom end of this engine is torn apart. I'm surprised there were no holes in the block, but I have to admit, these modular engines, for the actual block itself, I don't think I've ever seen one that has a hole in the block. These are stout engines, the 4.6 and the 5.4, at least for the short block. I'm not saying that a hole in the block can't happen, but even when it comes apart like this, it seems like it's really rare for these engines to actually poke holes through. So the next thing here that I'm going to do, I'm going to get the pickup tube off, oil pump off, 10 millimeter here, 2 8 millimeters here, and there's going to be 8 millimeters on the front of this oil pump, and we'll take all of this off. We are going to open this up because I have a feeling this is going to look absolutely terrible in here, and that will be interesting. I have got to take this crank out because I want to see what kind of damage is going on in here. So this little piece here, 17 millimeter. Now for all the connecting rods, these are all going to be 11 millimeter, so I'm going to get out what I can right now. I don't expect that I can save much of this, but we'll see. Looking at this bearing, it's got some wear to it, but it doesn't look half bad. We might be able to save a couple of these connecting rods for a different engine. Yeah, that doesn't look bad at all. All right, let's keep going on this thing. I went and found my Chevy 350 socket for the front of a crank, put it on a 1/2 inch ratchet, so now I can turn over the engine without a problem. But I'm gonna get this one out here. And oh, the bearing's stuck in there. It's worn, but it doesn't look bad. But at least the bearing saved the cap, so that could be reused. So I'm going to push the piston out now. Oh, if I can. Take my pry bar here. persuade it a little bit. There we go. Piston itself doesn't look bad. Connecting rod isn't bad. I'll put it back together. All right, move on to the next one. Even with this damage, this thing turns over like there's nothing wrong. Just insane. Yep, about the same amount of damage. We got some flakes in here. You can see that right there. All kinds of flakes. So this crank, completely unusable. So the block is most likely unusable too, but I'd like to see what kind of damage is truly on this block. Grab our persuader again. Get that out of there. There we go. Move on to the next ones. Yeah. They're looking about the same. Bearings still fairly intact, but you can tell that there's been flakes going through it. All right, one last piston in here. I mean, there are still 2 more pistons right here, but not connected to the crank. I can get this crank out without removing those pistons. Amazing how well this still moves. So I'm going to attempt to try to get this broken piece off of here. We'll see how well I do. Okay. There's one. This other one looks way worse. Ooh. Try a 12 maybe. Nope. Well, I'm gonna have to get creative here. Let's try that right there. So hopefully it doesn't spin. I'm going to put this right here, see if I can't smack this on with a hammer. Oh, come on now. Work with me. Okay. All right. Let's try to get this off of here. Wow, that crank spins so easy. There it is. Get the broken piece out of here. bearing is completely gone. Not a surprise. And there you can see there's nothing left of that. I'll get this crank out of here and get you a closer look at this damage here. Let's get these caps off. I'll get the side bolts out first, and then these main cap bolts here. On these Romeos, the side bolts are 13s. Looks like these are 13s, so I'm going to remove them. All right, with these removed, I'm not going to necessarily worry about where they go, since I'm probably not going to rebuild this engine. I'm also going to remove the rear main seal cover. There's 6 8mm bolts, and take those out now. I have all the bolts out, so let's get this cover off. Come on now. Gotta work it off those alignment pins down at the bottom. There's one side. Come on the other side. Let's go. Come on. Come on. Oh, you know you want to. Come on now. Let's go. Get your butt off there. Stuck on the crank. Okay. Wow. Okay. That was really stuck on the crank. It pulled the seal right out. Jeez. Okay. Sure. On these, you must screw in these spacers all the way to remove these main caps. So it looks like 5/16 is the one we need. And these things are reverse thread, so you'll want to loosen to suck it in. Okay, now with all these spacers moved in, we should be able to rock this side to side and get these main caps out of here. To help with this process, I went and grabbed a head bolt, and I'm just going to stick it in here and use it as leverage to move back and forth while applying a little bit of pressure on the underside of this piece right here, and you'll be able to get it out no problem. And oh boy, that bearing looks terrible. There we go. Okay, easiest way to get it, take something from the bottom, hit up to the top, get it out of here. And honestly, bearing looks okay. The other one was worse. With all the main caps off now, gonna get the crank out of here. So let's go in for a closer look here. This is where all the problems were. I mean, it definitely hit that block. It's really mangled down there. I don't know that I want to try to save this. I don't think it's worth the time or the energy. So I'm going to get these pistons out of here. Get it put back together, kind of, at least with main caps, and this is probably going to the scrapyard. Alright, get this piston out. It is, right there. Wow, that does not want to move. This is the... Okay, this one was not the one that had the valve in the cylinder. The other one is. Let's see what it looks like. Alright, here we go. Yeah, you can see all along the edge right here. Bring it in close for you. It is just mangled. Surprised it didn't break the piston, but definitely broke the connecting rods. And of course, since this connecting rod broke, I'm gonna take out the other one with it. I'm amazed this engine even ran at all. Amazing.
So if you can see right there, that is just mangled. I mean, it's really bad right here. I'd say that's probably a 1/4 inch down, and it was just grinding away. This up here is just, that's been smacked a couple times. Crank is junk, so that's going to the scrapyard too. This right here on a Ford is cylinder number 4, the last cylinder on the right bank. Valve completely gone. But you look in here, the electrode, yes, is touching. So it definitely hit the spark plug. But I don't see, get this gasket off of here. There we go. I don't see any significant damage. Usually you see like the little nicks and things everywhere, and I don't see that. So I'm gonna try to save this. I don't know that I can, but if there are cracks, a MagnaFlux will be able to show whether or not there's cracks in here. We'll see. We'll see if I could save these. If you've ever been curious about Windsor or Romeo valve covers and why it matters what head you have for a valve cover, look at the bolt pattern. This one right here is a Romeo. That is a Windsor. So there's going to be more bolts at the top and one more bolt at the bottom. It is very important when ordering a gasket set for these that you get one for your specific engine. A Romeo valve cover gasket will not fit a Windsor and vice versa. So make sure you order what you need. So I opened up the oil pump, and it's surprising that it's not worse. You can see gouges in there, but they're not bad. I've seen way worse, like deep gouges. This is not too bad. Still wouldn't use it, of course. But when you look at the rings too, you can kind of see some gouging. A little bit on the back side too. And the smaller ring here. Pretty much the same thing. But you look inside this case, and this really isn't bad either. Thank you for joining me on this teardown. This one was really interesting. I'm surprised it ran. That knock that was coming from it, we figured it out. And unfortunately, this can't be rebuilt, but we can possibly save heads on it if it passes the MagnaFlux test. And a couple things here and there, like there's a couple connecting rods that are still intact that could be reused. I'll keep them around. I might have another build in the future that I might need them. Who knows? We'll see. I hope you found this interesting. It definitely was for me to figure out what exactly was wrong with this engine. I'm gonna call it a day. It's getting a little bit late and almost dinner time. So on the next one, I'm going to be going through those heads, sending them off to the machine shop, and we'll go from there. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving me a like and subscribe so you don't miss anything with this 5.4 swap. If you have any comments or questions, leave a message down below. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you on the next one. Alright, time to clean up.